At the beginning of the movie, we meet Jen. She's out for a run, listening to a podcast about preparing for divorce. Her husband, Dan, trails behind her, struggling to keep up and pleading for some of her time. They've been married for so long that their relationship has become weighed down by unresolved grievances. Jen sprints along the trail circling a pond, but Dan finally manages to make her stop. She criticizes his appearance, but he's baffled. She's changed too. Trying to ease the tension, he points out the beauty of the pond and suggests they take a photo together. Reluctantly, Jen agrees, and they pose by the water. After the photo, Jen prepares to resume her run, confused as to why Dan even came along. The previous night, he'd gotten drunk at a party, ruining what was meant to be a celebration of her promotion. His embarrassing behavior shocked her colleagues, especially when he hit on the elderly accountant. Remembering this, Jen grows more frustrated and starts running again, leaving Dan behind. Dan struggles to keep up but soon slows to a walk. Meanwhile, Jen notices a hooded man standing by the side of the trail, his back turned to her. She doesn't think much of it and jogs on. Suddenly, Dan feels a sharp spasm in his head. At the same time, Jen hears a high-pitched ringing and stops in her tracks, but everything soon returns to normal. Eventually, Jen reaches the starting point of their run, but Dan is nowhere to be seen. She looks around, puzzled. Meanwhile, Dan stumbles through the bushes, breaking into a sluggish jog. Dan comes across a barrel of stagnant water filled with trash and floating debris, including a pair of headphones that look just like Jen's. At that moment, Jen appears, insisting she has something strange to show him. Dan tries to keep up as she runs ahead, but quickly runs out of breath. Desperate to explain himself, Dan apologizes to Jen, admitting there are many paths they could take in their marriage. Jen points out the sign marking the starting point of the trail and notices that the trail itself seems to have disappeared. Dan suggests there may have been two signs, but Jen doesn't recall seeing another. They run the trail again, circling the pond. Dan counts 4 loops, but Jen insists they've only completed 1. Yet, the trail remains gone. Dan searches the nearby bushes for answers, but nothing changes. Slowly, they realize something is very wrong. Every time they circle the pond, it feels as though they're starting over. Hoping to solve the mystery, Dan proposes they split up and head in different directions. Before parting, he apologizes to Jen, acknowledging that their long marriage sometimes drives him crazy, but he loves her deeply. Jen leaves, walking along the path until she finds herself back at the same no swimming sign. They both attempt to reassure themselves, hoping the situation will resolve itself. Then, unexpectedly, they bump into each other. Jen yells at Dan for scaring her, but he insists they stay together. As they discuss their predicament, Jen notices flashes of light near the pond, like someone is taking photos. Suddenly, Dan crashes into her again, startling her. He claims he couldn't find the trail and insists he hasn't seen her in a while. Frightened, Jen admits she's scared, and Dan tries to comfort her. They return to the no swimming sign and stare at it in silence. Dan asks if Jen hears the ringing sound in her ears, but she dismisses it as part of his hangover. Curious, he questions why anyone would want to swim in the dirty, algae-covered pond. Jen agrees, noting she hasn't seen anyone swimming, but wonders why the sign is there. Speculating that the sign might be deterring swimmers, Jen urges Dan to remove it. He tries but fails to pull it from the ground. Jen attempts to call someone for help, but discovers there's no signal. Dan checks his phone and confirms they're cut off. They continue along the trail, hoping to find reception, but instead, they come across the same barrel of putrid water. Frustrated, they decide to keep moving. As they run, they spot the hooded man again, standing with his back to them. Terrified, they flee in the opposite direction, only to end up back at the no swimming sign. This time, Jen notices a pair of headphones on the ground, identical to hers. She picks them up, confused, and accuses Dan of orchestrating an elaborate prank to punish her for being angry with him the night before. Dan denies it, arguing that he couldn't possibly move trees around to trick her. Determined to escape, they decide to cut directly through the forest. They trudge through the undergrowth, expecting to reach civilization, but there's nothing. No houses, no people, no signs of life. Exhausted, they stop to rest. Suddenly, Jen hears the same high-pitched ringing that Dan described earlier. Dan teases her, pointing out she doesn't even have a hangover. Jen brushes it off and tries to recall the direction of the nearby highway, but neither of them can remember which way to go. Tensions rise as Dan tries to make conversation, but Jen snaps, her mind filled with violent thoughts about stabbing him in the neck. She finds him unbearable, his snoring, his bad breath, and his lack of self-care. She confesses she wants to be happy with someone else, leaving him to die alone. Stunned, Dan agrees, saying it's fair. He acknowledges they'll probably never forgive each other and suggests they start divorce proceedings once they escape. When Jen coldly suggests he move in with his mother, Dan refuses, adding that his mother adores Jen. Jen assures Dan that his mother doesn't adore her and has always lied to him. The conversation grows awkward, and they press on, with Dan choosing the direction. As they run through the forest, they end up back at the pond. Jen has a meltdown, refusing to accept the reality and repeatedly yelling, "No." Both of them take off running, but they soon find themselves back at the same sign. Jen screams in frustration, while Dan begins to laugh, convinced it must be some cruel joke. After some time, they sit on the ground, unable to decide what to do next. Suddenly, they hear a man's voice ordering someone to run, but there's no one around. Dan tries to make sense of it, while Jen calmly states that someone must be advising them. They continue along the trail and see the hooded man again. This time, he runs off into the forest. They chase after him and find him standing with his back to them. Summoning their courage, they bombard him with questions, but he doesn't respond or turn around. Jen urges Dan to talk to the man, but Dan hesitates. He throws a small rock at the figure, but there's no reaction. Jen then taps the man on the shoulder and quickly retreats behind Dan. Suddenly, another hooded figure runs past them, and the first man finally turns around, shouting at them to run. To their shock, the man looks just like Dan. Blinking in disbelief, Dan turns to Jen, only to see another hooded man standing behind her. Before he can react, the figure brutally stabs Jen with a sharpened stick. Terrified, Dan flees into the forest. He stumbles back onto the trail and seemingly collides with someone. He hears his own voice angrily complaining about nearly being knocked over. Panicked, Dan quickens his pace, haunted by flashes of his bloodied, screaming wife. Finally, Dan finds himself back at the pond, utterly lost and unable to figure out what to do next. Suddenly, he hears a scream from the woods urging him to run. At that moment, he stumbles upon Jen. He tells her to stay there and runs off, ignoring her shouts after him. Dan retreats to a tree, where he vomits. After composing himself, he returns to Jen, baffled as to how she could still be alive. Eventually, he suggests they head in a different direction, and the puzzled Jen follows him. They walk for a long time, only to arrive once more at the familiar no swimming sign. Dan wonders aloud who would swim in such a filthy pond, but Jen counters that people might if the sign weren't there. She then picks up a tangled mess of headphones from the ground, though her own headphones remain securely in her pocket. Dan notices this Jen has sunburnt shoulders and suggests calling someone, but there's still no signal. Frustrated, he walks off down the path, with Jen trailing behind him. As they walk through the woods, Dan suddenly turns to Jen, promising not to lose her and assuring her that they'll make it out. Jen, bewildered, doesn't understand what he's talking about. Dan insists that once they escape, they'll start appreciating each other again. Out of nowhere, another Dan appears and strikes the first Dan on the head with a stick before running off to vomit nearby. This new Dan angrily complains that Jen never told him how terrible his hair looked. Jen, utterly confused, complies when the second Dan asks her to remove the sweatshirt from the first Dan. As she does so, she accuses this Dan of being clueless, pointing out that she comes from a different time loop. Jen puts on the sweatshirt of the second Dan, confidently asserting that all the versions of Dan are the same person. Meanwhile, the injured Dan regains consciousness, and the second Dan, in a surreal twist, starts beating his double. Unable to take it anymore, Jen kills the first Dan with a tree branch. Echoes of their argument about the party and the mysterious scream urging them to run reverberate in the air. This version of the couple tries to gather themselves, struggling to grapple with the bizarre situation they're trapped in. When they spot other versions of themselves on the trail, Dan is horrified by his appearance, seeing himself from the outside. Jen silences him, pointing out that the other pair hasn't yet realized they're caught in multiple time loops. Dan suggests following the other versions, but Jen protests, begging him never to leave her again. She insists they shouldn't split up. She believes this version of Dan is good, but what if an evil version appears? Dan joins her musings about clones, suggesting that if time loops exist, then so must different versions of themselves. Maybe somewhere, they're happy. But Jen is convinced they're stuck in hell together. Hearing the word hell, Dan considers the possibility that they might have actually died, hit by a car, or mauled by a bear. At least that would explain things. Jen cuts him off, asking him to stop talking because she's exhausted. Instead, she hypothesizes that aliens may have crashed nearby, and they, as usual, were unlucky enough to be caught in the epicenter. Just then, they hear voices, another pair of Dan and Jen arguing. Jen notes that she looks good, while Dan remarks that they look cute when they fight. The other versions run off in different directions, and Jen speculates this might all be some kind of lesson. If they learn it, maybe they can fix everything. Dan, however, believes only the best versions of themselves will escape. At that moment, yet another Dan emerges, only to be killed in front of them. Unable to bear the sight, the couple leaves. Jen asks Dan to catch some food, but he reminds her that they haven't seen a single animal. They wander the forest for what feels like an eternity until they stumble upon a trail. Jen suddenly wonders aloud what she would do here alone. Dan interprets this as a sign she's reconsidering the divorce. Jen reminds him that she's already killed him once, so he should probably keep quiet. Just then, another scream from the woods demands they run. They keep walking, but Jen suddenly has a breakdown, panicking at the thought of dying here. Dan tries to comfort her, even as she insults him in despair. She's losing her mind, unable to distinguish good from bad anymore. In an attempt to calm her, Dan kisses her, and they both realize that despite everything, they still love each other. Dan apologizes for all his mistakes, and Jen does the same. Then Jen spots a makeshift tent in the woods. The couple cautiously approaches and finds a tangled mass of headphones and Dan's phone inside, along with the badly decomposed body of one of his versions. They both realize there's no escape. They'll never get out. Faced with this grim truth, they confess their love for one another. At that moment, a hooded figure emerges from the woods and swiftly kills this version of Dan. Jen tries to flee but trips over the remains of one of her doubles. She runs to the lake, encountering doppelgangers of herself and Dan along the way. Wading into the water, she swims to the other side of the pond. Once ashore, she rests on a large boulder, but then notices a silver sphere in the bushes. Staring at her reflection, she is killed by another version of herself dressed in a filthy hoodie. Later, this hoodie-clad Jen drags her prize, her latest double, back to her camp, where yet another version of Dan is eating raw meat from one of their duplicates. It's clear that one version of the couple figured out they needed food and turned to cannibalism to survive this endless purgatory. The story is clearly a metaphor for marriage, two people trapped in an endless cycle of trying and failing to change one another, venting years of pent-up bitterness and disappointment. Only when faced with dire circumstances do they learn to rely on each other and accept their partner's flaws. So that's it. Hope you enjoy the story. Subscribe and press the bell icon for more videos.